Sir Kannan Gopalakrishnan. He was working as a senior architect at Engineering Design Research Centre, L&T Construction, India's largest construction company. He's also worked on projects ranging from institutional buildings to international airports, apartment complexes to aircraft hangars. He's also attended 3 international conferences and 2 national conferences, and has also presented technical papers at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi, and the MSRIT, Bangalore. He's also won the national championship at Archaman at the India's largest architecture quiz. Sir Kannan Gopalakrishnan currently runs a design firm, Habitat Design Studio, and he is also a visiting faculty at the renowned architecture schools in Tamil Nadu.
Welcome to UGC lecture series. This is AR 6502, History of Architecture and Culture 5. We will be starting with Unit 1, deals with leading to a new architecture. This is lecture 1, and before we get into this lecture, I would like you to understand why we study history in the first place. Often students complain telling history is a boring subject and history is not required for practice, and why do I even have to study history when I can be doing designs, beautiful designs, and getting better in my studies. History does help in becoming an architect. I am going to tell you why. As students, it will be very hard to understand the fact that it is very important for an architect, because history is the exact reverse of your design process. If you want to understand the design process completely, you have to understand history through its reverse angle. So, it is essential that you understand history. I will explain you why. In a design process, you have a certain context. You have the settings, the site, trees, landscapes, surrounding buildings, roads, everything is set, and you have been given the requirements, a set of requirements which you are going to do completely in a program inside the site. So, then you come up with a concept, then you design the building, you develop the concept into an idea, the idea grows into a building, the building gets all its required settings and everything, and so architecture develops from there. History is the exact opposite of that. Now, imagine you only have a building and very small portion of written text about it, sometimes not even that. All we have is the building to tell us the stories. From the buildings, we have to get the materials, we have to get to know about what the building is made up of. We have to understand the planning, we have to understand the layout, we have to understand the materials, we have to understand technology. We will also be able to understand the lifestyle of people, their culture, their traditions, how they lived, the activities which they performed in that building, their way of life, the climate of that particular region, and so on. Isn't it fascinating how much we can decipher out of a single building that exists at some point of time? So, that is exactly why we need to understand history in its proper manner. So, let us, now that we have understood why we are going to study history, we are going to study some history in the next few lectures along with this one. We will be dealing with History of Architecture 5, and we will be dealing with subjects from the period of modernity and after. So, let us get into the lecture straight away. In this lecture, you will be looking at why we do have to study history, the beginning of modernity, modernism and modernity, Enlightenment and the age of Enlightenment, neoclassicism and key proponents of neoclassicism. So, let us just straight away get into what modernity is. Modernity typically refers to a post-traditional, post-medieval historical period. Post-traditional period, what does it mean? Does it mean we had a long traditional period? No, post-traditional, and then there is another word called post-medieval period. They specifically tell you this is the period that comes after the medieval era. It is a period which is marked by the move from feudalism to capitalism, also towards industrialization, secularization, rationalization, the rise of nation states and its constituent institutions, and forms of surveillance. Before the modernity, during the medieval era, it was purely an agrarian kind of environment where feudalism was the only thing which was existing. We all know how feudalism works, right? There are a bunch of workers and then there is a feudal lord, kind of a boss. These workers work on a daily wages or a monthly wage or a weekly wage system. They work on the lands of the feudal lord. They till the land, they make produce, they reap the harvest. Finally, the feudal lord gets to sell all the produce and he gives very minimal wages to the people who are working with him. If somebody does not correspond to the system, it is most likely that they starve to death. The feudal lords were very wealthy and most of them were very greedy. This is a period where the feudalism kind of went down and then we moved on to capitalism, industrialization and secularization. But to understand all this, we must also try to understand certain terminology which we will be looking at the next few slides. First is bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is being impersonal, social hierarchies that practice a division of labor and are marked by a regularity of method and procedure. Bureaucracy is nothing but there is a scheme or a overall design or a list of set of procedures which are predefined in a social hierarchy and setup. So, this is bureaucracy. We need to also understand about disenchantment of the world. Disenchantment of the world is the loss of sacred and metaphysical understandings of all facets of life and culture. Previously, in the feudal era and in the medieval era, what happened was everything had a mystic explanation. People had explanations which were very metaphysical in nature. Metaphysical in the sense, people had the celestial bodies, people had all sorts of things that don't exist in the physical world to explain common things like sun and wind and rain. But at this era, we are calling it the age of enlightenment. So, people got to reason things, people got to understand things, knowledge spread, which means that the enchantment of the things got dissolved. So, the world became demystified. The great concepts of religion, culture, the world itself became a little more demystified, and this is what we call disenchantment of the world. The next concept is rationalization. The world can be understood and managed through a reasonable and a logical system of objectively accessible theories and data. This is what rationalization suggests. It means that there are a series of questions which can be asked and all the questions can be answered by properly accessible theory and data. You have answers, logical answers to all the questions, and all the answers have a sense of reason around everything. Nobody will tell you that it has been this way and this is why we are doing a certain thing. In rationalization, no one is going to tell you like that. They are going to tell you the reason why a certain thing is being done a certain way. Probably because it is easy, probably because it saves time, probably because it has a certain set of orderly principle, that is why a certain work is being done in a certain way. Nobody is going to tell you this is how it was and this is how it has been always and follow it without any reason or question. Nobody is going to tell that in the rationalized world. Moving on, we will be looking at a terminology called secularization. The laws of religious influence and religious belief at a social level. They say it is the laws of religious influence at a social level, which means the church, which was the most influential body back then, is not going to influence social character at all times. With the influence of the church in making the rules, in making the logic, in making all the laws of the land is going to reduce. Secularization is the process of taking away the influence which the religion had on the social structure. Decontextualization. Decontextualization is the removal of social practices, beliefs and cultural objects from the local cultures of origin. For example, if there is a local culture and tradition and people have been following that particular tradition for a very long time, and you suddenly take off those social practices, they are decontextualized, they don't have a context. And if a certain religious practice or a social practice or a cultural belief is applied to a different context, say an aboriginal species participating, doing a ritual is being taken and put in a civilized world, that becomes a decontextualization. You remove the context and then you mismatch it. You remove the belief from a certain basic context, that is decontextualization. Then we will be looking at something called individualism. Individualism is growing stress on individuals as opposed to mediating structures such as family, clan, academy, village, church, etc. This goes on to explain that if I made a discovery, if I made a beautiful invention, the invention has to go in my name. It cannot go in my family's name, it cannot go in my academy's name, it cannot go to my group of belief system people, it cannot go to my village, it cannot go to the church, it cannot go to any other organization. The recognition has to come to me. And also, if I have to face criticism for a certain thing, I have to face it in my name. There is no other thing which will be a responsibility. That is why in the medieval era, the sense of responsibility from an individual was lost, whereas in this age of enlightenment, the sense of responsibility by an individual has grown many times. We will also be looking at a few more definitions like nationalism. Rise of the modern nation states as rational, centralized governments that often cross local ethnic groupings. It is basically the rise of nation states as opposed to the papal states. Usually the existing thing was, what was happening was the church and its complete areas and dominion in papal states, and opposing to that there are modern nation states, monarchy and sometimes even democracies which form centralized governments, which often have a lot of ethnic groups together in one bundle. They don't have just one ethnic group forming one country, they have a lot of big ethnic group, lot of kinds of ethnic groups to form one country. Next is urbanization. Urbanization is the move of people, cultural centers and political influence to larger cities. When industrial revolution came, people started to move from villages and smaller towns to larger towns and cities. The cultural center became the city. The happening place, the most happening place became the city. The most economic zone became the city. The people in cities became richer and people in villages became poorer. That is when the urbanization became. It is the characteristic move of people and cultural center and political, social and economic influences from rural areas to large cities. Subjectivism. Subjectivism is the concept of turning inward for all definitions and evaluations of truth and meaning. It means you don't go to a particular book or a particular person for an opinion. You ask yourself, you turn inward for a certain definition or an evaluation. Am I doing right? You ask inward, you don't ask anybody else, because according to you, what matters is what is important according to this particular ideology. And it also means that people can have different ideas and different ideas can be expressed, appreciated and taken note of. There is no one universal truth in this particular setting. So, with these definitions, we can go and attack the term modernity. Charles Peer was a French poet who also produced notable works as an essayist and art critic. He was a pioneering translator of famous American writer and literary critic Edgar Allan Poe. His most famous work, The Flowers of Evil, expresses the changing nature of beauty in modern industrializing Paris city during the 19th century. He is credited with the coining of the term modernity to designate the fleeting, ephemeral experience of life in an urban metropolis and the responsibility art has to capture that experience. We will go on to look at a beautiful concept called the Age of Enlightenment. Why we call the Age of Enlightenment, I will tell you briefly. This is the age between 1650 and 1800. It invoked a specific movement in Western philosophy, the way of thinking itself. Modernity tends to refer only to the social relations associated with the rise of capitalism. Modernity may also refer to tendencies in intellectual culture, particularly the movements intertwined with secularization and post-industrial life, such as Marxism, existentialism, and formal establishment of social science. So, people started thinking and people started writing ways of life, people started writing philosophies. Different kinds of philosophies existed in this particular period. There were different branches of schools of thought and philosophies which branched out from this particular period of time. So, this age, it is called the Age of Enlightenment. People always confuse modernity with modernism. I will clearly tell you what modernism and modernity are and how they are going to differ. In context, modernity has been associated with cultural and intellectual movements of 1436 to 1789 and extending to the 1970s or later. It's simple. Modernity is something which happened in the 18th century, 17th, 18th century. Modernism is something which happened in the 20th century. Modernity is something that explains social conditions and experiences that are effects of industrialization and modernization. There were huge improvement in technology, economy, political process, philosophy, and every single thing with the advent of industrial revolutions in its center. Whereas modernism is a very prominent idea throughout the Western world, which is already industrialized. It happened in the industrialized world. The change in ideology or in terms of art, in terms of design, in terms of architecture, in terms of literature for almost the entirety of the 20th century, that was modernism. So, here is the difference between modernity and modernism as such. When considering the 20th century art and architecture and design, need to consider relationship between modern architecture and modern life. Modernity was a term first used by 19th century French poet critic Charles Baudelaire to denote the experience of living in the new modern world and describe the art of the mid 19th century. Baudelaire did not talk about how the trains and how the machines worked or how beautiful those machines are. He merely talked about how you live, how life has become in this modernized world. That is what he actually talks about. So, let us look at the beginnings of modernity. Like I was telling, Baudelaire wasn't just describing the physical or technological changes in the world, such as railway engines and new kinds of buildings, etc., but what it felt like to live in the new conditions. Can say that modernism gives form and symbolic expression to the consciousness of modernity. There was a shared structure of feeling which distinguished the modern world from the kind of experience that the people had in the world in the past. The modern condition, its difference being a key element of what made the modern as the modern. Let us quickly look at different characters of modernity. During the modernity, what all happened? Rise of the nation state, growth of tolerance as a political and social belief, industrialization, rise of mercantilism and capitalism, emergence of socialist countries, discovery and colonization of the non-Western world, rise of representative democracy, increasing role of science and technology, urbanization, and mass literacy. Amongst these things, we must look at growth of tolerance as a very important potential tool, because that is something which changed the way people were thinking back in the days, because that is the one spark which changed the idea of feudalism into capitalism. That is the one spark that created capitalism, that created the modern economy, that created mercantilism, that created socialism, and a lot of Western philosophies came from this single thing called growth of tolerance, because they were able to tolerate different ideas. If you come up with a new idea, I was able to say, okay, you have a different idea, and I appreciate that. That was something which we need to really understand and take from them. We look at a beautiful style called neoclassicism. Neoclassicism is the name given to Western movements in the decorative and visual arts. It also happened in literature, theatre, music, architecture, wherein they draw inspirations from the classical art and culture of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. The main neoclassical movement coincided with the 18th century of Age of Enlightenment. The beauty of neoclassical architecture is, we talked about the Age of Enlightenment, right? The neoclassical movement and the Age of Enlightenment exactly coincided. If you look at the features of neoclassical architecture, you will understand why I am so excited about why it is coinciding with the Age of Enlightenment. Age of Enlightenment is the age when people started thinking, people started reasoning out things, and people had reasons of why they are doing a particular thing and not merely following what was already done. So they had new reasons as to why they are doing each and every single thing. So they had the Enlightenment. And now let's look at some of the neoclassical architecture elements, and let's try and correlate why we're calling it, why it had to coincide with the Age of Enlightenment. In architecture, the style continued throughout the 19th and 20th century and even into 21st century, because there are a lot of buildings which sometimes follow the neoclassical style too. The neoclassical movement started after 1765 AD as a reaction against both the surviving Baroque and Rococo styles. Remember Baroque and Rococo styles? We saw them in History of Architecture 3, wherein we were looking at Renaissance architecture, and we were looking at Baroque and Rococo architecture as majorly highly decorative forms of architecture which existed in the Western philosophy at that time. So this neoclassical architecture was a reaction to Baroque and Rococo styles. It was a desire to return back to the perceived purity of the arts of Rome, because they thought Baroque and Rococo were merely clandestine. They were just on the exterior. They are just not pure. They are very impure. They are blankets over things that are pure. So they wanted to go back to what they thought was pure, the perceived purity of Roman and Greek styles. Neoclassical style was part reaction to the excess of Baroque Rococo, and was also partly due to the consequence of new discoveries of Greek Roman architecture. Also, what happened was, certain Greek Roman architecture building concepts were recently discovered, and then they tried to decipher what they did, and they tried to install those same concepts inside their buildings. So a part of the reason was because of a reaction to Rococo and Baroque style. Another part is due to the new discoveries which they made about Greek and Roman architecture. Neoclassical art and architecture is art produced in Europe and North America from about 1750 through the early 1800s, marked by the emulation of Greco-Roman forms. Neoclassicism first gained influence in Paris through a generation of French art students trained at the French Academy in Rome. Now here you can take a look at what happened when Neoclassicism started. You can see the way they made sculpture, the way they made paintings, the way they made architecture. Everything was related to how they thought was the process. They had thought process in every single thing, and the sculptures became more prominent. The sculptures became more thoughtful. They became more conceptual. The concepts and ideas of all the things that they were thinking were all reflected in the sculptures and architecture that they made. Let's take a quick look at how Neoclassicism started. In Paris, many of the first generation of neoclassical architects received training in the classic French tradition through a series of exhaustive and practical lectures that was offered for decades by Jacques-Francois Blondel. The finest example of this style were civic buildings and private houses. There were a few examples which were built during the early neoclassical era. Look at these buildings. It has all the elements of simple, pure architecture that was perceived by the neoclassicists. The architecture that they derived from Greek and Latin buildings, Greek, Roman architecture, the pediment, the columns, fascia, the window elements, plaster. The architecture was essentially simple as opposed to the Baroque and Rococo, because that is why they wanted to do something against Baroque and Rococo. They didn't want to do the same extra ornamental, ultra floral elements. They negated all those things. They formulated much simpler, much elegant structures in neoclassical architecture. Take a look at the picture. Look at how simple and slender the columns are, without a lot of architectural, a lot of ornamental detail. Most of the ornamentation is related plainly to the column capitals, to the pediments, or to some extent to guard the entrances, some extent to accentuating the entrances, and so on. To completely understand neoclassicism, we must also understand classicism, but that is for another lecture. So, we will be looking at classicism in the next lecture. Before we move on to the next subject, we will quickly see what we have understood so far in this lecture. We understood the need to study history. We also understood the difference between modernity and modernism, where people get confused, and we were now clearly explained about the difference between modernity and modernism. Modernism is in 20th century, whereas modernity happened in 17th and 18th centuries. We understood the origin and evolution of neoclassicism. We saw terminologies that were used in the context of neoclassicism. We also looked at properties and things that made up neoclassicism. We read about the age of enlightenment. We saw the basic concepts of neoclassicism, how buildings were used to build. And with this, we should be able to answer the following questions that are going to appear on the screen. What is the difference between modernity and modernism? Why do we study history, and how does it help us design better buildings? What is disenchantment of the world, and what does it have to do with rationalism? In the further lectures, we will be looking at other concepts relating to modernity and neoclassical architecture. So, see you then. Thank you.